I'm going to repeat one of the lines from that reading because it was the one that struck me uh, of that Bible reading, or the commentary that Swamiji made on that Bible reading. He says the essential message, or it is this: every state of consciousness has its own attractive power. And the more that we allow that attraction to act upon us, the more we attract to ourselves the objective circumstances and experiences natural to it. Now, think about that. In other words, what he's saying, as you think, where we put our attention, where we put our consciousness, you might say, where we live with our mind and our feelings, as we live in that world, of that mental world that we create for ourselves, so we become. We begin to attract to ourselves, as he said, the objective circumstances and experiences that are natural to that mental outlook or that state of consciousness. And that's quite an amazing thing to think about, and the impact that that can have upon us. In other words, whatever we dwell upon, we begin to attract it to ourselves. And now I emphasize the word dwell, and I'm going to come back and I'll explain what I mean by that. But I wanted to start by telling the story, which I'm sure most of you have heard this story. It's been told many times about there was a king, and the king was given a boon. And the king was given the boon of he could have anything he wanted just by thinking about it. And so he thought about, well, a wonderful palace. And so he had a wonderful palace and all the furnishings that go with it. Well, that manifested as well. And wonderful grounds outside the palace, beautiful grounds, and that manifested too. So he, in a sense, he lived his life fulfilled in everything that he could think about. And then one night, late at one night, he was sitting by an open window, and he heard in the distance, he heard the growling of tigers in the distance. And he thought, oh, tigers. And he thought, I wonder, look, this window is open. I wonder a tiger might be able to come into the window. And as soon as he thought that, of course, what happens? The tiger jumps in to his room and devours him. And of course, there's, it's obviously the imagery of that story is what's being said. Whatever we think about, whatever we dwell upon, we begin to track that. And you could say that each one of us are sitting under a wishing tree. In fable, of course, there's this tree that if you sit under that tree, anything that you think about, you're going to get. And there's, the jewel and the various chintamani and all of these things. This story is, you might say, universal, not just only India. Some version of this story is in all cultures, that you find that which is going to give you everything you want. And unfortunately, the world is actually like that. I don't know, I said unfortunately, I guess you could say fortunately too, but we don't think of it because we have to work so hard, and it takes you say time is a little bit stretched. It doesn't come immediately, but eventually there's a truth to this. We put our mind on something and it begins to come to us. But I use this word dwelling, is we have to dwell on something because there's millions of thoughts that are passing through our mind at all time, and they don't all come to us just because there's something passing through our mind. And an important thing to remember is that we're in a sea of thoughts. We exist in a sea of consciousness of billions of people on this planet, and there's trillions of thoughts that are happening every day. And we think that I somehow create those thoughts. But Paramahansa Yogananda said something very profound. He said, we do not create our own thoughts. We attract those thoughts. We draw those thoughts to us according to our consciousness. That thoughts are universally rooted, not individually rooted or individually created. Now that takes a little bit of thinking about to get used to that, because we think, of course I think by thoughts. I created that thoughts. The brain created that thoughts. And maybe it's not immediate that may be not the case, but if we think about it and through our individual experience as we go through life, we'll see there's a great deal of truth to what the Master has said, that those thoughts are there and we tune into them, just like the image is always used of the radio station. We turn the dial and we attune a little bit of static, do it a little bit more, and we get perfectly attuned to those thoughts, and we begin to open that channel to be able to receive those. And this, of course, is the principle of attuning. Be careful what you're tuning your channel toward, or what channel are on the radio are you listening to. But we attune to those. Now, we all know when we meditate that there's lots of thoughts. They just come, pass through us, and they're always distracting us, but we know that most of them, we stand back when we meditate and we just observe. They come in one side, you might say, of the mind, and they go out the other, and you don't, and we're taught, don't hang on to them. Just observe them. And finally, you begin to slow down that passage of thoughts. But every so often, one of those thoughts comes in, and it's interesting, isn't it? And all of a sudden, we follow it. We dwell upon it. And when we dwell upon it, we get engrossed in that thought, and it pulls us away from our meditation. We forget what we're doing, and we become involved in that thought. Well, life is much like that. We get pulled. We get pulled into one direction, and we get pulled in another direction. And and pretty soon we find ourselves in situations that we never thought that we were going to be in. But it all started with those thoughts. It's not just thoughts, it's those feelings. Sometimes it's even memories. They come up and they turn themselves into thoughts and they pull us away, but they're not ours. There's things that we have opened ourselves to, and it comes. And so then we hang on to it and we begin to dwell on it. Now, think about it too. Sometimes, what are those things that we're thinking about? Or you could say, as Swamiji mentions in the reading, he says we think about and we project and we start seeing the faults of this world. Perhaps we see the faults of our neighbors, and we start dwelling upon those thoughts. And pretty soon we get engaged in that, and we begin to create, they begin to manifest, because we're seeing something that's within ourselves and we're projecting it outward on somebody else. And we begin to manifest by thinking of our neighbor's faults. We begin to awaken those very tendencies within ourselves. And the same thing is true within ourselves. We see, oh, I see my faults, and I feel guilty about them, or I'm not as good as I want to be, or perhaps we have thoughts come in that are, very negative thoughts. And I think all of us must have these from time to time, of the thousands that go through our mind every day. And we start to feel guilty about it. And we say, I shouldn't have those thoughts. And we start to fight with those thoughts. And what it does is those very thoughts themselves has magnetically drawn us into engaging with them. You see, they're magnetic, some of them more so than others. Most of them are just stray thoughts, you might say. We let them go. But there's some that they have a magnetism to them, and they pull us. So the fact that we maybe have negative thoughts, things that we're not proud of to be thinking about, about something negative about somebody else, but that's not really, that just happens. The real problem is when we start to dwell on the thoughts. We begin to wallow, you might say, in that thoughts. And when we start to do that, that's when we get ourselves in trouble, because what happens is it starts to create that little seed thought. We start to dwell on it and think about it, thinking of it, begins to take on a little bit of power. So the trick is, of course, is not to hold on to them. In other words, don't let those thoughts become sticky. Some thoughts are really sticky. They're attractive because they have that, and pretty soon we're going to be following, and we're going to be finding ourselves in there. And so what we have to do is, is disengage ourselves, have that sort of mental little bit of mental attitude toward those thoughts and those things that are attractive to us that we don't really like. Now, that's one half of the battle, of course, is just to reject those thoughts. And there does have to be in the spiritual path, there does have to be a certain amount of sternness of purpose. I'm not going there. I know, I don't, this certain person I don't like, and I keep thinking about it, but I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there and be thinking about those things as I start to create that magnetism. So there has to be a certain amount of self-discipline to do that. But the answer is just as like when we meditate, when we practice Hong Sa, we practice various techniques, is yes, you have to let those, being mindful and just observe, not hang on to them, but it helps also to have something positive to think on. And so, of course, the real solution is not just to disengage yourself, but to engage yourself into those things that are positive. And so immediately, if you find yourself being pulled by temptations, negativity, yes, you got to protect yourself from that. Don't dwell in them, but put yourself into a positive frame of mind and go towards something that's on the positive side. And this, of course, what the devotee does, is we engage ourselves in positive activity. There was a master used to say, he says, all of us are tempted, because this world of Maya, if that's just the way it is. I mean, that's how this world is. It's a nest of temptations, of pulls in one direction or another, and we have to find our way and to be able to navigate that. And he says, but wouldn't it be much better to be tempted by good things? See, we can be tempted by things that are going to take us in a direction we don't want to go. But unfortunately, it seems like that seems to be more magnetic than being tempted sometimes by good things. And Master would say to that, he said, once you contact God, get a little bit of taste of that, it's like tasting good cheese. You won't want the bad cheese anymore, the stale cheese. He says, why? And when this world is going to be extremely attractive to us, but we have to, the way to escape it is to be tempted by that experience of having some divine experience. And until we have something to compare to the attractions of this world, of course we're going to be attracted because all of us want happiness. That's what we're trying to find. We're trying to find happiness and we just mistake it in the wrong place. So, when when the person first, my own experience was this, and I suspect it was the experience of many of you as well. When you first come to these teachings, I read the autobiography of a yogi and I was just so on fire that I thought, this is what I want in life. And I began to meditate, and although I wasn't very good at it, I could see the potential of it. And so I had a lot of earnest enthusiasm for it. And because you have that enthusiasm, because I had that enthusiasm, it was more tempting than the things that I perhaps had been doing before, and I wanted to go that way. And this is, you could say, one of the successes to keep us going on the spiritual path is to always keep that. Or look back, even if you've lost remembrance of it, look back. What was it that brought you onto the spiritual path of meditation, onto becoming a disciple of the gurus? What was it that brought you? And you keep that awakened in your consciousness, and you'll find that if you can keep that alive and feed that, then you'll find that that's what you're going to be attracted to. But when that begins to become stale, the world begins to raise up its head and say, "Here I am," and you begin to be attracted to that. Master would complain to divine, he would meditate and he would be in communion with Divine Mother, and he would say, "Divine Mother, why didn't you make yourself more tempting than temptation?" He says, and And he would argue. He said it this way with Divine Mother. He says, "You made these things so tempting, and they seem to be for most people more tempting than you." And he says, but then he would say, then, or Divine Mother would reply back to him. He says, "Yes, but if there were no temptation, well, then there would be no world." Isn't that interesting? The world would disappear. There would be this creation itself wouldn't exist if there wasn't that temptation. So you could see it's just ingrained into the reality. But it also holds in Divine Mother's response to Master, it holds the secret of for our own salvation and for our own freedom. He says, if there is no more world, in other words, we transcend this created world into divine bliss when we can go beyond temptation. And the way to go beyond that temptation is to see that God is the most tempting of everything. Now, I remember something that Master had said in that when we first start meditating and we come on to spiritual life in this lifetime, you could say that we have these samskars from the past, and they could say that they're sleeping, they're dormant. When we come into this world, we've come in as a little baby, and usually they're dormant. They're waiting for circumstances to be appropriate for them to reawaken, and usually perhaps as a child, circumstances are not ready yet. If they were to awaken at that point, now sometimes they do, of course, in child saints, but for most people, if they had awakened at that age, most people would not be able to act upon them in a way to make use of those. So they wait usually until we reach our maturity and beyond childhood. And at that point, circumstances arise where these spiritual tendencies, these soldiers, sleeping soldiers, as Yoganandaji said, they awaken. Something awakens them in us. We come on, the time is right, and this army of soldiers awakens within us. And when they do, we're that inspiration for wanting to take up the spiritual path that perhaps we've been marching in this direction for lifetimes, many lifetimes. It's reawakened again, and something deep inside us remembers that that's what it is that we really want. And we take up the spiritual path again with a great deal of earnestness, and we go forward again, and we continue our journey of lifetimes, perhaps from the past. But it's like, I like to look at it like this. It's an army of soldiers that have awakened to help us to overcome these worldly inclinations that may still be lingering within us. Well, like any army, it has to be fed. That army will come to our aid and fight on our behalf if we invite them and we rally them and we lead them. But that army has to be fed, or else pretty soon they're not going to be vital to be able to help us. And so we have to feed that army. And this is what the spiritual path is continually feeding those tendencies that are existing within us to help us overcome those pulls of those negative tendencies there. But behind it all is to ask ourselves, where does our mind and our consciousness dwell? And if we keep it dwelling on the positive side, or keep it dwelling on God reminding activities, we'll find that the circumstances will arrange themselves to support that. But to the degree that we start, you might say, we're tempted to say, well, I'm pretty safe in my castle right now. And, I'm going to just go out into the local countryside, or I'm going to go into the local town outside of my castle and just, I can go there and explore. Well, we find that as our consciousness changes, we're no longer in that castle of peace. Then we find now we're in the castle of restlessness, And in that castle of restlessness, circumstances arrange themselves to make it seem like this is my natural home. It's like that Prince and the Pauper story where they change identities, and you find that you change you begin to think the way you're the pauper's now in a rich clothing and in a rich man's house, and he's now and he takes on those mannerisms. The other fellow, of course, now becomes a pauper, and then he finds himself in straitened circumstances, and he begins to see the world, which we begin to do. We see the world according to that. Swamiji used to tell this story. That, the way he said it was always fun. I like to. He says we look at the world through tinted glasses, and he says like a man goes into a clothing store and uh, he tells the fellow, "I want to buy a green shaded. I want to buy a suit in the shade of green." And the salesman comes out and shows him a nice, light colored, white colored suit, summer suit, nice white suit. And the man says, no, no, no. And he says, look in the mirror. Doesn't that look nice? And the man stands in front. He says, yes, it's a very nice suit, but it's not the shade of green that I want. And I says, oh, I'll fix that. He gives him a pair of sunglasses. Now look, it looks green. And he says, Swami used to use that story years ago. And he says, that's how the world is. We just put on a pair of sunglasses or a pair of tinted glasses, and we begin to see the world as we choose to see it. That's natural. And pretty soon, that's my natural environment. And you forget that you're really the prince, and you've taken on the trappings of the pauper, and you forget who you are, and you get lost. This is, like the story of the prodigal son. One other point that I thought that Swami makes in this reading, he says, when you get tempted and you find yourself grabbing onto these thoughts, and you start going down a road that isn't healthy for you spiritually, and you make mistakes, and you do misdeeds. And he says it's an interesting phenomena of the mind that, in the way he said it, he says, air clutches its misdeeds to itself. In other words, if you make a mistake, a person will often tend to justify it. Yes, but, and find all the reasons why that was the thing to do. And it's just that tendency to justify, and the mind follows the heart. The heart wants to do something, and the mind it'll find all the reasons why that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And we have to be on the alert for that. Because again, when we start to dwell with our mind in a certain direction, that's perhaps taking us away from where we really want to be, the mind will dwell on it, and then the heart will it's attractive. And the reason we dwell is because that's an attraction. So that's attractive to us in some negative magnetic way. And then next thing you know, we find all the logical reasons why that makes perfect sense. We feel natural, of course. Even though there might be a little bit of your conscience says, wait a minute, let's think about it. And if we listen to our conscience, our higher self, you might say, the master speaking to us, if we allow the master to speak to us, we keep that consciousness open. But the tendency is to reject. We don't want to hear that side of it. I was years ago when I was a kid, there's a really nice movie, kids movie. It's called Pinocchio, and maybe many of you have seen Pinocchio, but the original Walt Disney one I think is best, because some people think it's so kind of old-fashioned, out of date, but I like it because Walt Disney seemed whoever was writing that movie, it was probably Walt Disney, but he had a way about the moral lesson in there. It was Pinocchio is his nose grows big when he tells a lie, and he carries there's this little cricket that stands on his shoulder and is whispering into him. The cricket is always there. whispering when he's doing something wrong, until finally Pinocchio gets tempted and to go in the wrong direction, and he goes to a place called Pleasure Island. Now, I never thought about that when I was a kid, but that was later on. I thought that was kind of clever of Walt Disney. He named it Pleasure Island. He goes to Pleasure Island, and Pinocchio gets tempted into doing all sorts of mischief and wrong things. And his conscience keeps, the little cricket keeps telling him to, no, you shouldn't do this until, and Pinocchio, of course, banishes the cricket, doesn't want to hear it. That's how we often are. And of course, Pinocchio ends up getting turned into a donkey. And but he gets rescued. But nevertheless, that's how we are. It is we tend to justify our misdeeds. And I think I've told this before in other satsangs, but Swami once said one of the qualities that we must have on the spiritual path, if we hope to be able to stick to it for the long haul. Because somebody had asked him, what are the qualities necessary to stick to the spiritual path over the long haul? Because many people come and many people go, and they short-termers. But for the long, he says, one of the qualities you have to have is self-honesty. Always be honest with yourself. He says, you can't, you shouldn't be able to fool yourself. Don't lie to other people, of course. Be honest with everybody. He says, and of course, be honest with God, your higher self. Be honest with Guru. Be honest with yourself, your own higher self. To be able to catch yourself. Oops, I didn't quite do it right that time. But you got to let it go. Because you see, if you just, some people, they do things that are not right, and then they start dwelling on it. They can't walk away from it because guilt itself is something that has a magnetism, and you just embed that, whatever it was, you start to embed that consciousness in ourselves. So you have to let it go. And the best way to let it go, of course, is not concentrate on that. Bring, like we do in Hong Sa, bring the mind back to Hong Sa, or bring the mind back, Guru, bring the mind back, reveal thyself in the light, and try to go into the light. And in this way, then we'll bring ourselves back into what it is that we truly want. So I think, my master asked Divine Mother, why does this world seem to be more tempting than you are? Well, it's because we let it be more. We don't dive deep enough because Divine Mother's waiting for us, and she has a great patience to wait as long as it takes. But as soon as we reject that, say, I'm not going there anymore. I don't want the stale cheese. I want only good cheese. Then Divine Mother begins to respond. And then we see nothing, when we have that experience of the divine coming to us, nothing at that point can tempt us away. And that's what each of us needs to get to, that point in our spiritual journey. And then those soldiers are awake and ready to help us in everything we do. And you begin to see, everything begins to fall into place. And you can see, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all of these other things will be added unto you. And that's the secret of the spiritual path. Keep your eye on the goal. Keep your eye on God. And if the other stuff comes, it's gonna come. Don't feel bad if you have negative thoughts. Just don't get sticky. Don't let them stick to you. Bring it back. Bring your mind back again and again and again and again. Joy to all of you. Joy to all of you. Now,